The snow fell in endless whispering sheets over the mountain village of Larenbrook, painting the rooftops white and muffling the world in silence. Inside the small chapel at the heart of the town, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and cold stone. Ethan Hale, a young man of 25, stood stiff in his father's old wool coat, his hands clenched behind his back as the priest spoke words that seemed to echo from another world. His bride, Eleanor Whitmore, graceful, dignified, and 55 years old, stood across from him, her silver hair pinned in a neat twist beneath a white fur hood. Her eyes, a clear and steady gray, met his only once, soft with resignation. Outside, the world celebrated the season's first snowstorm, but inside, neither could feel its beauty. This wasn't a union of choice, it was a pact of necessity, arranged by fate and the debts of family honor. Ethan's late father had owed Eleanor's family more than money. He'd owed loyalty, a promise that Ethan now paid with his hand in marriage. Eleanor wasn't cruel. She was quiet, composed, almost regal in the way she carried herself. The villagers whispered behind gloved hands, their breath misting in the cold air. "She's old enough to be his mother. Poor boy. He'll never love her." Ethan heard them all. He kept his head down as the priest bound their hands with a silk ribbon, the red thread of tradition standing out against the white of the snow that drifted through the open chapel doors. When it was done, Eleanor extended her hand for him to take. Her touch was light, trembling slightly as though she too didn't want this. "Thank you," she whispered. Two words that carried both apology and grace. After the ceremony, they rode in silence through the forest to her estate, a sprawling stone manor that stood alone on the edge of the frozen lake. The snow thickened as they went, covering the world in silver and silence. Inside the carriage, the space between them felt miles wide. Ethan watched the frost gather at the corners of the windows, each flake melting against the glass like tiny sighs. He had expected to feel bitterness, anger maybe, but instead he felt something quieter, sadness, perhaps even curiosity. Why had this woman, wealthy and independent, agreed to marry someone like him? When they arrived, she stepped out first, her boots crunching on the snow. "You may have your own room," she said softly, not meeting his eyes. "I don't expect anything." There was a brief pause before she added, "You're free to live here as comfortably as you can." Eleanor's home was beautiful, but cold. The walls were lined with portraits, her family, her late husband, her youth captured in strokes of oil and memory. Ethan spent his first nights wandering the hallways, listening to the creaks of the old house and the wind howling through the eaves. He found her sometimes in the library, reading by the fire, her face glowing softly in the golden light. She never spoke first and he never intruded, but there was something in the way she turned pages, slow, thoughtful, delicate, that fascinated him. He found himself watching her longer than he should have. Days passed, then weeks. The snow outside grew deeper and the world seemed to vanish beyond it. Ethan worked in the stables, chopped wood, fixed what was broken around the house. She always thanked him with quiet sincerity, offering tea or a warm meal in return. They were strangers bound by vows, yet in the hush of winter, something fragile began to stir between them, a warmth born of shared solitude. One evening, when the blizzard raged fiercest, the lights flickered and went out. Eleanor found him in the kitchen, a lantern in her hand. "The power lines must be down," she murmured. "Would you help me light the fire?" He nodded, and as they knelt together before the hearth, their hands brushed. She pulled away quickly, embarrassed, but the spark that lingered in the air between them was undeniable. Later that night, as the fire crackled and the snow fell endlessly outside, Ethan caught her humming softly to herself, a lullaby from decades past. Her voice was warm, low, soothing. He leaned against the doorway unseen and listened. For the first time since the wedding, the bitterness in his chest eased. Maybe, he thought, this wasn't punishment after all. Maybe it was something else, something he hadn't yet found the words for. The days in Larenbrook stretched long and white, the world muffled by snow that refused to melt. Every morning, Ethan would wake before dawn to light the fires and shovel the paths around the manor. He had grown used to the quiet, to the way the cold made the air sharp and honest. Yet every time he passed the library door, he slowed, listening for the faint rustle of Eleanor's pages or the steady rhythm of her breath when she fell asleep beside the fire. It was in these moments that he began to see her, not as the woman he'd been forced to marry, but as someone altogether different, someone kind, wounded, and quietly brave. Eleanor had once been the wife of a nobleman twice her age, the villagers said. A man of wealth and pride who left her widowed young but comfortable. She'd lived alone for years since his passing, managing the estate, giving to the poor, and tending to her gardens in the warmer months. Ethan had expected her to be cold, distant, perhaps even vain, but instead she surprised him. She spoke gently to the servants. She laughed softly but genuinely. When the cook burned bread or when the snow piled so high against the windows they had to use the back door. And when Ethan came in from the cold, cheeks red and hands raw from chopping wood, she would press a cup of hot tea into his hands without a word. One evening, he found her outside, standing by the frozen lake, the world around her bathed in moonlight. She wore a long gray cloak trimmed with white fur, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "It's dangerous to be out here alone," Ethan said, approaching her carefully. She didn't turn at first. "I used to come here with my husband," she said quietly. "He loved the reflection of the stars on the ice. Said it made the world feel closer to heaven." She glanced at him then, her eyes glimmering with memory. "I suppose that's why I keep coming back, to remember what once felt real." He didn't know what to say. He had never loved anyone before, never lost anyone either, but the ache in her voice touched something deep within him. "You don't have to stand here alone," he said softly. Her lips curved faintly. "Neither do you." They stood side by side, watching the frozen lake shimmer beneath the moonlight. Two souls tied by circumstance but beginning to find something more. Days turned into weeks and the blizzards grew fiercer. The world outside their walls disappeared entirely, swallowed by white. Inside, the manor felt smaller, warmer. They began to share their meals by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes with stories that spilled easily from the heart. Eleanor spoke of her youth, of the books she loved, the places she dreamed of visiting but never could. Ethan told her about his childhood, the farm, his father's debts, the day he realized freedom was a privilege he'd never known. She listened with a tenderness that startled him. Once, when he apologized for speaking too much, she smiled faintly. "It's been a long time since anyone filled this house with a voice other than my own." That night, when she played the piano in the parlor, the melody wrapped around the firelight like silk. It was a song of longing, of something beautiful and unfinished. Ethan stood at the doorway again, heart heavy with emotions he couldn't name. She stopped mid-note and looked up at him, her eyes luminous in the flickering glow. "I'm sorry," she said, almost embarrassed. "I haven't played for anyone in years." "Don't stop," he murmured. "It's beautiful." She hesitated, then continued, and when the last note faded, they sat together in silence, the warmth between them deeper than the fire. Then one morning, he found her in the garden despite the cold, pruning frost-covered roses. "They won't bloom," he said, smiling faintly. "I know," she replied, brushing snow from a brittle stem. "But I prune them anyway. Hope needs tending even when it seems foolish." The words struck him like sunlight through cloud. Hope. That was what she was. Hope disguised in quiet sorrow. He knelt beside her, helping her gather the dead leaves. Their hands touched again, and this time neither pulled away. As the days passed, Ethan began to notice the small things. How her eyes crinkled when she smiled. How she hummed when she cooked. How her laughter, rare and unguarded, could chase away even the coldest silence. He realized that he waited for it, sought it, needed it. And she, though still careful, began to soften around him, her glances lingering longer, her words warmer. It wasn't sudden. It was gentle, like snow melting beneath sunlight. One evening, when the power went out again, she brought out candles and placed them across the parlor. The light danced across the walls, soft and golden. "It feels like the old days," she said wistfully, "before everything became quiet." Ethan, watching her in that amber glow, felt something shift inside him. "You make quiet seem beautiful," he said. She looked up, startled, color rising to her cheeks. "You shouldn't say such things, Ethan," she whispered. "People might misunderstand." "Then let them," he said simply. That night, neither spoke of it again, but the air between them was no longer empty. It was alive, charged with something tender and real. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and endless, but inside the old stone manor, two hearts that had been frozen by circumstance began to thaw, slowly, sweetly, irrevocably. By late February, the snow had turned from gentle to merciless. Each morning the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows of the manor, shaking the trees until their branches cracked. The world was white, blinding, and endless, so much so that the horizon disappeared. Ethan spent his days ensuring the estate stayed livable, clearing chimneys, chopping wood, fixing the barn roof that sagged under heavy snow. Eleanor worried, of course. She would watch him from the kitchen window, her hands curled around a mug of tea, her brow furrowed with quiet fear. "You shouldn't go out there alone," she'd say whenever he came in, snow dusting his hair and shoulders. "I've lived through worse winters," he'd tease, but her concern always softened him. He was beginning to realize that her worry wasn't polite, wasn't duty, it was care. One afternoon, the snow began again, thick and fast, the sky turning gray before noon. The horses whinnied in the stables uneasy. Ethan went to calm them, knowing the storm would last through the night. He was halfway back to the house when he heard it, the sharp crack of ice and the rush of something heavy giving way. The old oak by the frozen lake had split, its limb falling across the path. He hurried toward it, clearing what he could before the wind grew too fierce. But in his effort to move the heavy branch, the ice beneath his boots groaned, a sound he barely registered before it gave out. The world plunged cold and dark. Water swallowed him whole. He gasped, reaching for air, for light, for anything. But the lake had no mercy. His lungs burned, his limbs numbed. Panic clawed through him as the current tugged him under the broken ice. Then hands. Strong hands. Eleanor's voice screamed his name. He didn't know how she had reached him, but she was there, pulling, shouting, her face white with terror. Somehow she dragged him to the edge, falling to her knees in the snow as she pulled him out, both of them trembling and soaked to the bone. "Ethan!" she cried, pressing her hand to his cheek. His lips were blue, his body shaking violently. "Ethan, please, please, stay with me." She half carried, half dragged him back to the house, her cloak torn, her breath ragged. Inside, she stripped off his wet clothes with trembling hands and wrapped him in blankets by the fire. "You foolish man," she whispered through tears, "you could have died out there." Her voice broke. She pressed her forehead to his, tears mixing with the snow still melting in his hair. "Don't you ever scare me like that again?" He could barely speak, but he managed a weak smile. "You saved me," he murmured. "You came for me." She pulled back, eyes shining. "Of course I did." For the next few days he drifted between fever and sleep, but he was never alone. Eleanor stayed by his side, changing the damp cloths on his forehead, holding his hand when he shivered. Sometimes he woke to find her reading softly to him, her voice like warm honey in the dark. Sometimes he woke to find her simply watching him, her expression tender in a way that made his heart ache. "You should rest," he'd whisper, and she'd only shake her head. "Not until you're well." When the fever finally broke, the snow outside had softened, glittering beneath the morning sun. Eleanor had fallen asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting on her arm. He studied her quietly, the lines of her face, the streaks of silver in her hair, the faint smile she wore even in sleep. She was older, yes, but she was beautiful, not in a fleeting, shallow way, but in a way that felt like truth itself. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She stirred, opening her eyes. "You're awake," she said softly. "Thanks to you," he replied. That afternoon, when he managed to stand, she helped him to the window. The snow glittered like glass, the world washed clean. "You almost died," she said again, her voice trembling. "If I lost you, Ethan." She stopped, unable to finish. He turned toward her, his hand finding hers. "You didn't lose me," he said quietly. "You never will." She looked up, startled by the conviction in his tone. "Eleanor," he said after a moment, his voice low, uncertain but true. "I think I've been waiting for something to feel real my whole life. And it found me here, with you." For a long moment she said nothing. Her lips parted as if to speak, but emotion stole her words. Then she stepped closer, so close he could see the shimmer of tears in her eyes. "Ethan," she whispered, "don't say what you'll regret." "I won't," he said, his voice steady now. "I don't regret you." The words hung in the air, fragile and sacred. She looked away, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered. "I'm old enough to have loved and lost," he interrupted softly. "To know what love really means. I don't care about the years between us, Eleanor. I care that when you look at me, I feel seen. I care that you came for me when no one else would. She stared at him, torn between disbelief and longing. Then, without thinking, she reached out and cupped his face in her hands. You foolish boy, she whispered, her voice breaking. Why must you make me feel young again? He smiled faintly. Because you are. And in that quiet room where the fire cracked and snow fell softly against the windows, she leaned forward and kissed him, hesitant, trembling, but full of truth. The kiss tasted of salt and warmth and everything they had both forgotten how to hope for. That night, as the storm faded beyond the hills, the two of them sat by the fire, her hand in his, neither speaking. They didn't need to. Outside, the world was frozen, but inside something had finally begun to thaw, for good. When the snow began to melt and the first weak light of spring filtered through the clouds, the world outside seemed reborn. The roads cleared, the birds returned, and with them came the villagers, bringing their whispers, their judgments, their curiosity. For months, Ethan and Eleanor had lived cocooned in their quiet winter world, untouched by gossip or glances. But as soon as the first messenger from town brought supplies, the peace fractured. They say you haven't been seen in months, the man remarked, eyeing Ethan curiously. Folk are starting to wonder how the young husband's faring in the arms of the widow. His smirk was small but sharp. Ethan said nothing, only thanked him. But when he returned inside, Eleanor saw the hurt flicker in his eyes. She tried to pretend it didn't matter. She told herself that what they shared was private, sacred, too delicate to be stained by idle talk. But the whispers grew louder with each passing day. When they went into the village together for supplies, heads turned. Women murmured behind baskets of bread. Men exchanged knowing looks. Shameful, someone muttered loud enough for Eleanor to hear. She's old enough to be his mother. The words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. That night, when they returned home, she sat by the fire in silence, her eyes shadowed. Ethan found her there, hands clasped tightly in her lap. You heard them, he said quietly. She nodded once, her voice low. They're not wrong, Ethan. You deserve more than this. Don't say that, he said sharply. You think I care what they whisper? You should, she said, finally meeting his gaze. Because you'll be the one who pays for it. I've lived my life, faced the world's judgment already. But you still have time to build something for yourself. You don't owe me your future. He knelt beside her, taking her hands gently in his. Eleanor, when I married you, I thought I was giving up my freedom. But you gave it back to me. You taught me what peace feels like. What love feels like. If the world doesn't understand that, let it burn. Her breath caught and tears welled in her eyes. You can't mean that. I do, he said softly. I mean every word. In the days that followed, their love became quieter but no less fierce. They still shared tea by the fire, still walked the snowy paths at dusk, still spoke in soft tones when the world seemed too loud. But beneath their calm was resolve, a shared unspoken vow to stand together. And when the first real challenge came, they did. It happened one morning when the village council summoned Eleanor. Rumors had spread that she'd coerced Ethan, using wealth to trap him. They'll demand proof that you're not using me, Ethan said bitterly. They won't believe it's love. Eleanor smiled sadly. Then we'll show them. They arrived hand in hand, their breath misting in the cold air. The council hall was full. Neighbors, shopkeepers, even the priest who'd wed them. Eleanor faced them all, her voice steady but soft. You all know me, she began. You've known me since I was a girl. You know I've never taken from anyone what wasn't freely given. This marriage may have begun as an arrangement, but what it became was something neither of us expected, something real. The murmurs began, skeptical, dismissive. But when Ethan stepped forward, the room stilled. You think I was forced into this? He said, his voice low but steady. You think I'd stay if I didn't want to? You're wrong. I've lived among you all my life, working, fighting, struggling. None of you saw me then. She did. When I was nothing, she treated me like I was someone. If that's a crime, then so be it. The hall fell silent. Even the priest looked uncertain. It was Eleanor who finally ended it, taking Ethan's arm. We owe no one an explanation, she said softly, and together they walked out into the sunlight, leaving the whispers behind. That evening, back at the manor, they stood by the lake again, the same lake where she had saved him months before. The ice was melting now, the water dark and shimmering beneath the fading snow. I never thought I'd have the strength to face them again, Eleanor said quietly. You gave me that. Ethan smiled faintly. You gave me everything else. She turned toward him then, the wind lifting strands of her silver hair. People will keep talking, she murmured. Let them, he said, brushing a thumb along her cheek. They can't change what's true. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. What is true, Ethan? She whispered. He smiled softly. That I love you. The words hung in the air, unshaken by doubt, unbroken by fear. Eleanor opened her eyes, tears glistening in the fading light. Say it again, she breathed. I love you, he whispered, pulling her into his arms. And when their lips met again, it wasn't out of defiance, it was out of peace. Out of gratitude. Out of a love that had grown against all odds in the heart of winter. As the sun dipped behind the snowy hills, the world seemed to hold its breath. The lake shimmered, the air stilled, and in that perfect, fragile moment, two souls, one seasoned by time, one bright with youth, stood together, unashamed, unafraid, utterly and beautifully free. The winter finally surrendered in silence. Snow melted into silver rivers that whispered through the hills, feeding the valley below, and Larnbrook began to breathe again. Flowers, hesitant and bright, pushed through the damp soil, dotting the thawing ground with color. For the first time in months, the world smelled of earth instead of frost. Ethan stood by the barn one morning watching the sun rise over the lake that had nearly taken his life. It was whole again now, glimmering like glass, reflecting the pale blush of dawn. He heard the soft crunch of boots behind him and turned to see Eleanor, wrapped in a shawl of soft gray wool, her cheeks pink from the chill. It's beautiful, she said, her voice like music carried on the wind. He smiled. So are you. She shook her head, amused, but her eyes softened. There was a new light in them these days, one he hadn't seen before, the light of peace. For so long, she had lived as if waiting for something to end. Now she seemed to live as if everything had just begun. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly. Regret me? No. He stepped closer, brushing a wisp of hair from her face. I meant the life you might have had if things were different. She hesitated, her gaze lifting to the soft sky. I used to, she admitted. Before you. Before the snow. But sometimes, what we think we've lost only clears the way for what we were meant to find. Her eyes met his again, shining. I was meant to find you. The weeks that followed were simple and sweet. They worked side by side, repairing fences, planting early seeds in the thawing soil, reopening the greenhouse that had been abandoned for years. The manor, once cold and quiet, filled with life again. The servants returned, laughter echoed in the halls, and even the village, after its whispers faded into boredom, began to accept what had once scandalized them. People who once turned away now stopped to greet them. The same priest who had married them arrived one afternoon with a gift of wildflower seeds. For your garden, he said with a gentle smile. Every spring deserves its bloom. Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the small sack, tears glistening in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. In time, they began hosting small gatherings at the manor, neighbors, children, travelers caught in late snow. Ethan played the violin he'd once kept hidden in the attic, and Eleanor at his side would hum softly along. Their laughter mingled with the crackling of the fire, the scent of cinnamon tea filling the air. It was as though the house itself had awakened, the ghosts of the past replaced by warmth and belonging. People no longer saw their age difference, they saw their love. And love, once born in a storm, had become the hearth that warmed everyone who entered their world. One evening, as twilight painted the sky gold and lilac, Ethan found Eleanor in the garden. She was kneeling in the soil, planting the priest's wildflower seeds with careful fingers. The air was cool, the ground still damp from melting frost. You'll catch a chill, he said softly, kneeling beside her. She smiled faintly. Let me finish this last row. You've already planted half the garden. Then I'm half done, she teased. He laughed, brushing the dirt from her hand before helping her to her feet. You never rest, he murmured. I rested too long, she said. Now I want to see everything bloom. They stood together, watching the horizon where snow still clung to the distant peaks. Do you ever think about the winter? He asked quietly. All the time, she said. But not for the cold, for the warmth it gave us. She turned toward him, her eyes soft and shining. If the snow hadn't fallen, you wouldn't have been here. I would have kept living half asleep. And I, he said, would have never learned what love really means. That night, as they sat by the fire, Ethan took her hand and placed a small velvet box in her palm. "What is this?" she asked, smiling as she opened it. Inside was a simple ring, a thin band of silver shaped like a snowflake. "You already gave me one," she said softly, referring to the ring from their wedding day. "That one was given to me by others," he said. "This one is from me." She stared at it for a long moment, eyes glistening. "It's beautiful." "It's a promise," he said. "Not of duty, not of debt, just love." Tears welled as she slipped the ring onto her finger. "And mine," she whispered, "is a promise to never let fear steal what's beautiful again." He leaned forward then, pressing his forehead to hers. The firelight flickered across their faces, painting their world in gold. "Do you remember?" she murmured. "That first night, the one when the lights went out?" "I do," he said softly. "You said you didn't expect anything of me." "And I never did," she smiled. "But somehow you gave me everything anyway." Outside, the last snow of the season began to fall, light, soft, fleeting. They stood together at the window, watching it drift through the night. "The snow's back," he said. "It always comes back," she whispered. "But it never stays forever, just long enough to remind us what warmth feels like." Years later, when the villagers told stories of the winter that refused to end, they also spoke of the manor by the lake and the love that bloomed there. They said that on certain mornings when the frost kissed the fields, you could still see two figures walking hand in hand by the water's edge, a young man and a silver-haired woman, their laughter echoing across the ice. And if you listened closely, you'd swear you could hear the piano playing softly from within the old stone walls. The same melody that once carried a lonely heart into love. Because love, as it turned out, didn't belong to youth or time. It belonged to those brave enough to find it in the cold and keep it burning through every storm. And for Ethan and Eleanor, that flame never went out. It lived on, in their home, their laughter, their garden, and every snowflake that fell after. The end, a love that began in winter and lasted through every season.